Hi everyone, my name's Brenton and welcome to episode 11 of my vlog KidLit Corner. I am really thrilled to have a very special guest with us today, Australian children's author Sophie Masson. Sophie is one of Australia's leading authors for children, young adults, babies, and adults as well. She's written well over 80 books, published internationally, and many books translated into multiple languages. She has won or been shortlisted for several awards for her books, including the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, the Aurealis Awards, the David Awards, and the CBCA Notable Books. She was honoured with an AM in the General Division and the 2019 Order of Australia Day Honours List for services to literature as an author, but also as a publisher, as she founded the publishing press Christmas Press, its imprint Eagle Books, and with fabulous Lorena Carrington, Pardalo Press. Now, you'll know many of Sophie's titles, but just a few that you'll recognise are The Hunt for Ned Kelly, A House of Mud, The Snowman's Wish, Saturn, Sydney Under Attack, The Key to Rome, Cold Iron, Forest of Dreams trilogy, The Ghost Squad, and her new chapter book for children, which has just come out, Sabina and the Cats of Rome. You might also know about Sophie's other life as an adult author under the name Sophie Beaumont. And coming out in a couple weeks is her new adult novel, A Secret Garden in Paris. You can
Glad
visit,
you got a copy.
yeah, it's fantastic. And if you want to find out more about Sophie's books, you can go to sophiemasonauthor.com. But she's also active on Facebook and on Instagram. Sophie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Brenton. It's lovely to meet you on screen and lovely
Yeah,
to be talking with you.
yeah, same here. It's really great. And, we have limited time for an interview, but you've got so many books and such a long, rich career. So we're going to try to condense that as best we
Yeah.
can to try to cover as much as possible. But I know it'll be really interesting and really insightful talk to hear from you. So I want to sort of jump back right to the very beginning and show people um, the earliest efforts because it's nearly 35 years since you published your first books. You had two books out in 1 year, and that was an adult novel, The House in the Rainforest, and your first children's novel, which was Fire in the Sky. You've consistently been writing since these two books, always enjoyable, always high quality stories, and moving across genres and across age groups. So I'm wondering, how has your writing process changed or grown since your first books came out? And how have you maintained staying published in such a varied long career?
Well, yes, as you said, I had two books published in the first year, but the adult novel, The House in the Rainforest, was the first one, and because the publisher took so long to answer me, they took more than a year to say yes. Or in fact, I didn't hear anything for more than a year. I had already started writing another book, which turned out to be Fire in the Sky, and which was actually accepted much. Much quicker than the adult novel, and I had always had this feeling that I would like to write across the age groups. I had published a short story in an anthology called Beyond the Echo, which was, I think, published in 1988 or something like that, which was basically writing, short pieces by multicultural women, and because I'm from a French background, native French speaker, and so on, and born in Indonesia and what have you. So I wrote something which was published. That was my first published story in a book. But the next year, I had a short story published in an anthology called um, uh, After Dark, And that was compiled by Gillian Rubenstein. And I had just seen an ad in Magpies which said that she was looking for short stories for stories about, what kids do after dark, sort of thing. And it was at the time that Halley's Comet was around. And so I wrote this story called It Only Happens Once. Um, and so right from the beginning, I had that double thing because I think partly because I have a very strong memory of being a child. I kept a lot of diaries. That was also the thing. And some of them, even though my mother chucked out most of my stuff, she was a great chucker outer. Well, but she had 7 kids, so if she'd kept everything, the house would have been drowning. But I do have a diary from when I was 12, and I have a big novel that I wanted to write, which I started writing when I was about 16 as well. And I had been writing lots and lots before that. I have poems and all sorts of stuff still. And so it wasn't just that I have a good memory. It's also because I wrote things down at the time, I actually knew. I couldn't pretend that I was more worldly or more knowing or more sophisticated than I really was, if you like. And so I had a real feel still. And I guess because my childhood was fairly unusual in many ways for many reasons. So I was a kid who observed things a lot and who looked at things very closely. Like, because some of the time, my parents were quite strict, and we had to shut up and just go and do stuff and leave them alone, sort of thing. And for me, it was like taking notice of small things because I wasn't allowed to do all the things that my Australian friends could do. So it was, I guess, all that, plus the fact that obviously I had grown up and I was interested in how childhood and youth formed an adult. And really, that's what The House in the Rainforest is about, because it starts off when Kate, the main character, is 16. And she comes from a totally different background to me. So this was another interesting thing about those 2 books. One of them is set in a place that is totally different from where I grew up or how I lived. And it was actually on the north coast of New South Wales, in a very impoverished timber milling village that had just lost its timber mill. And there was new age settlers coming in. This was like in the 70s. And then the other one, Fire in the Sky, is about my mixed thing of French and Australian and everything else. So, my writing process then, I guess, was, and looking at my that novel that never got published, that I never finished, the novel I wrote when I was 16, which was a huge Tolkien type thing, except I wanted to include every mythology in the world, nothing like ambition. But the voice, sure, it's much more amateurish than how I write now, but the voice is the same, which is very interesting. The dialogue, everything like that rings in the same way, even if it's not quite as accomplished, So the writing process for me really is about a thing that just, I have an idea, I write it down in a notebook and I think about it a lot, and then I just sit down and do it. I don't plan beyond knowing what the beginning is going to be like. And even then, I don't plan as such. I just jot down little things. If you saw my notebook, it's completely all over the place and, only understandable by me. But it is a very natural writing process because I think as a child, like I said, we had to find our own entertainment a lot of the time because we had to stay at home a lot of the time. And so I wrote a lot and I amused myself both by creating little adventures and stuff. And I wasn't scared of it because, kids aren't afraid of writing and doing stuff. And so it just kept going from that. And even though now, I guess it's become more sophisticated in some ways, at base, it's the same.
And now you're making a living and you get paid to do that.
That's
Just like as
right.
a kid,
I
and that's
mean,
fantastic.
that is just amazing. I still pinch myself, I still cannot believe it because like I say, I loved writing, I loved reading, I loved
Yeah.
adventures in books and stuff. But even though our house was full of books, my parents big readers in French and English, especially my mother read in both languages. And we were encouraged to read, and we also weren't prescribed, like they were strict, but not in that way. They didn't overlook the books we read, they let us make our own decisions. So we got books out of the library and so on. And, but I could see all the names of all these authors on the books that we never got. We didn't have authors visiting schools back in those days. And I didn't know what an author was like. I mean, I didn't know if you needed to have some special degree or did you need, and it was only when I was a teenager that I started realizing that they were real people like me.
Yeah.
And I had sent off some poetry to poets whose work I'd enjoyed at school, Australian poets. And some of them answered, and some of them were incredibly generous in the way that they answered. So, from then, like, I wouldn't say that I had any kind of plan to become a professional author. It was like a natural progression as I learned more about things, and then as I started writing I mean, I had tried to write novels, and then one day it happened that this one novel, The House in the Rainforest, caught the attention of this publisher, the University of Queensland Press, even though it took them a year to answer me.
Yeah. And the rest is
Yes,
history. Yeah.
that's right. I mean, but look, it is an amazing thing. I can't begin to express how grateful I am to the publishers, to the readers, to everyone who's ever encouraged me, because it really is a dream come true. It is something that is as natural to me as breathing, and to be paid to do that. I mean, and to give other people pleasure. That's the
Yeah.
other thing. It's really important.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. You mentioned the novel you wrote when you were 16 and you're trying to put all the mythologies into it. Now, mythology and fantasy and fairy tales, you write a lot of books uh incorporating those like Moonlight and Ashes and Scarlet and Snow, Once Upon an ABC, Magical Tales from French Camelot, The Hand of
Yeah.
Glory, The Green Prince, The Crystal Heart, so many sort of fairy tale based books and with fantasy and myths in them. So, what is it about that type of story that appeals to you the most?
Well, it appeals to me very much because from the start, like I said, I was born in Indonesia, but when I was a baby, about 9 months old, I got very sick, and my mother took me back to France and left me with my paternal grandmother, and I stayed with her for about 4 years. So I didn't see my parents in that time, or my older sisters, or the younger sister who was also born in Indonesia. So I had that totally French upbringing at first. My grandmother and aunts only spoke French, and they were very keen on fairy tales and told me quite a lot of them. And of course, in France, you could actually go to places where fairy tales were actually written and created and so on. And I always loved all those stories with magic and fairies and magic gifts and all sorts of things. And they're great stories as well. They're very condensed stories, but they're great stories, and they have everything in them. And they're very deep stories, even though they appear simple on the surface. And also, when we arrived in Australia, so eventually my parents came back from Indonesia, picked me up, brought me to Australia with them because that was their next port of call. They worked in different places around the world because my father worked for a big French building company, a civil construction, massive projects, airports and dams, bridges, things like that. Anyway, so they'd worked in Africa and then Indonesia and then Australia. And Australia, because Australia is a safe place in terms of health and everything else, so they brought me with them. So I had to learn English. I had to meet my parents and my sisters and come across the other side of the world to a country I'd never heard of before, which might have as well have been a fairy tale country for all I knew. And but the very first book I learned to read in English was a little collection of fairy tales, which is called the Blue Book of Fairy Tales. But it's a little golden book, and it's a beautiful thing. And I did find a copy of it many, many years later in a garage sale in Armidale. And it just reminded me, when I opened the page, I immediately fell into the pictures like I had when I was a kid. So there was Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, and Toads and Diamonds. Now, I knew all those stories, including Toads and Diamonds, because it's actually an old French fairy tale. And so, that was the first book that I read for myself in this new language. So it sort of imprinted itself on me in that respect as well. And of course, I continued loving fairy tales, and my parents loved them as well. And we had lots of books of myths and fairy tales and from all over the world. Um, so that's the reason why. And so it became a very natural part of my inspiration, if you like. And as you say, yeah, I've had there's lots and lots of books where there's fairy tale elements,
Yeah.
and some of them are deeply fairy tale-ish, and others have an element, and a lot of them do have that. Like, for instance, one of the books I wrote under the pen name of Isabel Merlin, it's called Three Wishes, so that's obviously a fairy tale thing. But even though it's set in the contemporary world and there's no actual magic in it, it is still based on a fairy tale template and of careful what you wish for, um, and like you can see, I can see there in the background, you've got On My Way. On My Way is a fairy tale picture books like Once Upon an ABC is, and like The Snowman's Wish is, and even like Saturn is, really, in a
Yes.
sense. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very deep part of the wellspring, if you like, of my
Mm.
writing.
Well, it comes across beautifully. And Saturn, I was actually just thinking as you were speaking, Saturn is such a sort of fable fairy tale feel.
Yeah.
On My Way, that twist at the end, very fairy
Yes.
tale, and
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's fantastic. And it you say it's sort of like, the well in you, and it comes across reading them. It does feel
Mm.
like this is just naturally poured out of your skin in a way,
Yeah.
they do feel just very much a part of you. And I was recently reading Moonlight and Ashes,
Yes.
and you just feel that as the reader that you're there in the hands of someone who loves fairy tales and loves myths
Yeah.
and legends and that sort of thing. So they make for fantastic reading.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, no, it really is a very important part, for me, of my inspiration, and continues to inspire me,
yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing that you sort of I feel as a reader sits side by side with the fairy tale and fantasy books you write is historical fiction because history is infused in many of your books.
Yeah.
Books that are just maybe set in the past, but also pure historical fiction books as well. Um, one of the big sellers and prize winners is The Hunt for Ned Kelly, and then
Yep.
Ned Kelly's Secret, My Father's War, War and Resistance, 1914, The Farlight Mystery, Jack of Spades, so many. So I'm curious along the same lines, what attracts you to writing historical fiction, and what's your process in coming up with an idea, researching and writing a historical novel? What can you tell us sort of you speaking generally or using a specific historical novel, what that sort of routine is like for you?
Yeah, sure. Look, with historical novels, you obviously have to do a lot of research, and you have to start. So, with the Hunt for Ned Kelly, what I did was I started with a postcard that I'd seen in Beechworth. In one of the little museums there, that's used to be the jail, and Ned Kelly was imprisoned there at one stage, just when he was young, and there was a photograph, a postcard you could buy, which is a postcard which is called The Kelly Gang, and it shows three men on horseback and in the bush, and they have been identified as Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, and Steve Hart. And Joe Byrne, who was the fourth member of the gang, appeared not to be there that day. Who knows what he was doing? And anyway, so the three men are there on their horses, and you can see it's in a bushland setting, and under a tree there's a tripod that's leaning up against it. So this would have been the photographer's tripod. What it looked to me was like the photographer had been taking photos, in bush, whatever, with all the gear that they used to have to carry around. And but then these guys turned up, and it was a kind of impromptu photo in a sense. And so he didn't set up the tripod, or she, because in my story it is a she. And so it was impromptu, but at the same time not unwelcome on the part of the gang members. So otherwise they would not have allowed them to take this picture. They were quite flamboyant young guys, they were quite happy with the celebrity that they had, even though things were very dangerous for them, etc. And so this was part of it, the whole thing. And in fact, Ned Kelly was one of our first big celebrities, if you like. And people followed him in the newspapers. And when they had the siege at Glenrowan, there were reporters sending stuff down the line, down the telegraph lines every hour in Melbourne, and people weren't going to work. They were standing in the street waiting for the next installment. What was going on at Glenrowan? Because there were heaps of reporters there. The police had actually invited the press to come up to Glenrowan. So it was like that, those things. That postcard, immediately I thought, oh, this is interesting. Who took this photo? Nobody knows who took the photo. Nobody knows exactly where, but they know positively that the identification is right of the men in the picture. And so that got me thinking, and I thought, nobody's ever written about this before. Why not? Ned Kelly, the great sort of Australian folk hero, with 20 million books have been written about, and yet nobody has said anything about it. So I did a bit of research about the postcard, which was sold at the time by a postcard company in Sydney, which had since disappeared, and they sold them by the truckload. But the photographer's name is unknown, So what remains of it is a postcard. And that postcard has been reproduced many times since then. So, starting from that, what I start with when I do a historical novel is the gap in the records, the thing that people have missed, the thing that will enable you to sneak into the story without doing damage to the historical framework. So during the year that Ned Kelly was on and his gang were on the run, like for 18 months, nobody actually knew where they were. They popped up in various places. There were sightings of them here, there, and everywhere. This is in the last 18 months of their lives. And there were people who said, oh, we saw them at a dance, down the road, and we saw him in the street or whatever. Nobody knew. The police couldn't find them. They had Aboriginal trackers looking for them, but they couldn't find them either. These guys were really good bushmen too. So, and it was only because Joe Byrne emerged out of hiding and went to shoot Aaron Sherritt, his ex-brother-in-law. He was connected to him anyway. And Joe Byrne was a kind of loose cannon of the group, difficult to control, even by Ned, who was fairly controlling. And so that's where I thought I could situate my story, in that time when nobody knew what happened, but leading up to Glenrowan and what happened afterwards. So, I situate my stories in those gaps when it's about a real person like Ned Kelly, or with others, for instance, like The Understudy's Revenge, which I can see you've got on the shelf there above you. It's set in the 19th century theatrical world of London. And even though I don't talk about any real people there, I did lots of research about what the theatre world was like at the time, and how you could actually set a story which is also based on Hamlet, in a sense, as well, in that world without doing damage to what was possible. Yeah, so it's about research, but it's about looking also for that gap. Similarly, like with the Barlap mystery, I Farlap was about a year before he died, just before the 1930 Melbourne Cup. He was shot at before the cup was run because basically he was winning every race. The bookies had a terrible time of it because basically he just smashed the opposition every time. And so it's believed that, somebody allied to organized crime, allied to bookies was responsible. But they never actually found out who did it. And I looked that up and I looked up, there's still, you could find things online on Trove about police reports, like in the newspapers, which actually even said, that the number plates of the car where the people had shot at him from, the number plates were false number plates. And so, then I looked up, okay, who handled number plates at the time? It wasn't something like a roads and traffic authority, it was the police. And so the police didn't bother really looking that far. But that gave me my start for my story, with a private detective who's looking for the mystery, who might have shot at Farlap, and it goes on from there, sort of thing. So that's what I look for, and I look for the gap. I do a lot of research, and a lot of stuff doesn't actually find its way into the book, but I feel like I need to know myself. So, for instance, how much did it cost? How much would it cost to buy, say, a ham sandwich in the 19th century? How long would it have taken to go in a coach from Melbourne to Beechworth? How long would it have done? All those things. So I look them up and I calculate things, but I don't say, oh, it took blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I just do it so that the continuity is right, so that it doesn't sound like it wouldn't be possible for this kid to buy ham sandwich or whatever. And I did that even like with much further back, like the key to Rome. The Romans were great record keepers. They were great documenters of every damn thing. And so, they were truly bureaucrats with a bureaucratic state of mind, in their colonies. So they itemized and numerized everything. And also their roads, because they kept them so well, and there's still a big network of them. And there are lots of people who are interested, and they do things like walk from this place to this place just like they would have done in Roman times. So you know exactly how long it would take.
Yeah.
Thank God for the internet.
That's fantastic. I love that, finding the gaps in history. That's fantastic. That's a great way of putting it. I like that. Are you so and you have so you say you have to do all the research just to know it for yourself even. So are you doing it all the research up front and then writing a draft afterwards, or sort of in tandem?
Yeah, in tandem, I do start with, um, researching certainly the background, the overview,
Yeah.
and the start, so that I know I can off in confidence in this journey into the
Yeah.
past. But I'm constantly looking things up, okay, how long did it take to do this, and this? Because I come to a point where I'm thinking, okay, they're going to buy something. What would they have found in that type of shop in those days? So I look that up. Um, so I get little bits and pieces, but it doesn't interrupt me a lot. It just
Yeah.
becomes a natural part of it. But I'm departing from a strong base.
Yeah. You are. When I read one of your historical novels, I do feel that. I feel that strong base. And
Mm.
I think it's not specific to historical fiction, it's any story, but I like reading a book, and I imagine many readers do, where you feel the author knows everything. They might not be telling you everything, but they know
Yeah.
everything, and they've created, even when you've found a gap in history of a real world, you've created
Mm.
characters and created a situation. it still
Mm,
feels always so structurally strong, historically strong, and it's
thank you.
always a pleasure to read.
Thanks very
Um,
much.
Picture books are a big thing in your career as well. You've written many
Yep.
picture books. We'd mentioned On Our Way and Saturn and The Snowman's Wish. And I want to give a shout out to Sea Monkey, Building Site Zoo, Santagram, Two Rainbows, Join the Parade in Armadale, which is where you live, and so many
Yes.
more. Can you talk a little about what's it like to write in the form of a picture book and having that picture book text interpreted by an illustrator and what that's sort of like for you?
Yeah, look, I have loved picture books forever, ever since obviously I was a child and then right when I was reading to my own kids and on, and I did write a couple of picture book texts when my kids were growing up, but they never really got anywhere until my first grandson was born, my
Mm.
daughter's son, oldest son, and suddenly somehow I started writing poetry for kids, and it unlocked the picture book
Yeah.
gene, if you like, that had been slumbering away. And suddenly I knew what to do. So, Two Rainbows was the first one that came out of that. And I had originally written it as two poems, um, and one of them was actually published as Bushland Rainbow, which was the sort of country part of it. And then the second one I had written called City Rainbow didn't get published, but then I had this idea of combining them and turning them into something different, into a narrative. Um, and so that actually somehow it had clicked. I can't explain it exactly more than that. It just happened. It was like the poetic thing came back. I hadn't written poetry for a long time, and suddenly it came back expressed as poetry for children. And suddenly that also made picture books happen. So, picture books, as you know, are kind of have a toe in the water of poetry and but they're narratives.
Yeah.
So they're not just, I mean, some poems can be narratives, of course, but a lot of them are impressions, moments, crystallizations of experience. But a picture book must have a narrative, even if it's very simple. Um, so it's a beautiful marriage of the two things. So that you with picture books you get that lovely economy and crystallization of poetry, but you also have the story. So you get the best of both worlds. And somehow, after Two Rainbows, it just went on and on and on. Like it was just, oh, I've got this and this and this. And sometimes they came out of, yes, seeing little kids like my grandchildren sort of waking up to the world and understanding certain things and whatever. And other times it came out of totally different things, like fairy tale or myth, or out of a dream, like Snowman's Wish did, and out of a bizarre experience, like Saturn did, seeing a satin bowerbird on the side of the road in an environment that it shouldn't have been in. So it's like they come from all different directions. And I love writing them, but I also absolutely adore the experience of collaborating with a fellow creator, with the
Yeah.
illustrator. And I don't always meet them in person straight away, anyway, because usually it's the publisher who chooses the illustrator. But I've never, not even when I was starting writing picture books, I never say I would like it to be illustrated like this and this, or this person's got to look like that. It's like I'm creating an atmosphere with a picture book text that the illustrator can respond to in their way.
Mm.
And I totally trust that. It's funny because, a lot of people feel that you would need, because the text is originating. The original idea is yours. It's originating with a writer because that's nearly always the way it is. Apart from author illustrators, of course, who do both. It's very rare for a picture book to come out of an illustrator out of an illustration and then
Yeah.
become, how get a text come out of it. Although I guess there are rare instances of it, but I create that atmosphere, and it's up to the illustrator to get what they want out of it. I want them to feel totally free. Um, Now, the thing is, I have been extremely fortunate because there has never been a case with any of the picture books where I thought, oh my God, what am I going to say? When the publisher, because the publisher always lets you know, we're thinking of this person. What do you think? This is their style, you
Yeah.
know? And so often I'm surprised. I think, oh, okay, I hadn't thought that it could be like that. But then I think that'll be fantastic. It'll be
Yeah.
a really wonderful discovery to see what they do with it. And I have never been let down, never, ever.
Yeah.
It's a question of trusting that other creator, that other creative mind, and it's such a pleasure, you know. And of course, there have been instances like when I've worked with Lorena, where we know each other and we understand absolutely where we're each
Yeah.
coming from, and that's wonderful,
Yeah.
fantastic. But I've contacted all the illustrators after they had started with the book, whatever, to say how grateful I was to them and all that sort of thing. So it's a wonderful experience,
Yeah.
and I'm so grateful that I've had it.
That so beautifully sums up that collaboration I feel because you're so right. All the picture books, the work, like I love Saturn, I love the Snowman's Wish, and I think that is just stunning. But all of your picture books, the text,
Mm.
the artwork, they match really beautifully.